Delighted to be joined by everyone today. Welcome to today's session organised by British Pugwash. My name is James Brady and I'm on the executive board of British Pugwash, the organisation dedicated to providing a forum for scientifically informed discussion of the risks of nuclear weapons and other existential risks to humanity. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tariq, Rauf, who will be presenting on the 2026 review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we'll be discussing the review process, whether an outcome document is required for the review conference, and as well as expected friction points between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. We have approximately 30 minutes or so dedicated to Tariq's presentation, and then we have time for around 20 minutes of discussion on today's topic before closing at 3 o'clock. Just some housekeeping before we begin. I would ask that you please check that your microphone is muted at this point. Now, before we get started, I'd like to give an introduction to Tariq, Rauf. He is an independent expert on nuclear governance based in Vienna. He's an expert trainer on disarmament and arms control at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, Hiroshima, and the International School on Disarmament and Research on Conflicts, ISO-DARCO. Tariq is also a member of the board of directors of Canadian Pugwash and a member of the Council of Pugwash Conferences. He has had a long and distinguished career and worked with or on behalf of various national governments, international organizations, and academic institutions, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Japan, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, the IAEA, and other eminent international academic institutions at the forefront of disarmament and non-proliferation affairs. Tariq, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm delighted that you could join us, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. I'm going to hand over to you at this point. Please do go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and I'm delighted to join British Pugwash in this discussion on next year's review conference. I will focus most of my comments on the review process because this is something that does not usually get discussed, whereas there are many forums in which we discuss the friction points, particularly as regards nuclear disarmament, but I'll touch on them very briefly. But the main thrust, I will talk about the strengthened review process, my understanding of it since I worked in writing it up both in 1995 and in 2000, and in trying to get the chairs of various PrepCom sessions and the presidents of review conferences since 1995 to try to hew to the instruction that was unanimously agreed in both in 1995 and in 2000. So, seems that, okay. So in order to lighten the proceedings, I included some cartoons from Carlton Stoiber, who was a US nuclear specialist, particularly in nuclear law, and he is a very perceptive cartoonist. So those cartoons are copyright and should not be copied or used by anyone else. So this is the first one. It's a sort of interesting one, calling up diplomats to go to the NPT meeting in New York. So one delegate has said that the experience of going to an NPT review conference is like starting smoking. At first you feel ill because you're at the initial stages of asphyxiation, and then you get used to it and feel something important. Then you get dedicated and feel you're being initiated into some kind of an arcane priesthood. And to a certain extent, this is what the NPT review process has become over the years. There are some people who understand it, and there are others, newcomers, who constantly struggle with this, and it becomes a very frustrating experience for both sets of persons. At the last review conference, one of the ambassadors saw me, and this is what he said, that I was an NPT dinosaur and should be taken out on the street and shot. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So as you know, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came about as a result of efforts by supporters and promoters of nuclear disarmament, Ireland and Sweden, over a number of years. But the key resolution was in 1965, Resolution 2028, sponsored by Ireland on having a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So that resolution contained 5 cardinal principles for a future NPT. So the first one was that there should not be any loopholes through which a nuclear weapon state or a non-nuclear weapon state could propagate the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. The second was that there should be an acceptable balance between the obligations and rights of both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. The third was that this treaty should be a cardinal contributor to achieving nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. Fourth, it should have provisions for effectiveness, that is verification. And finally, that this treaty should not adversely affect the rights of states to conclude nuclear weapon-free zones in their respective regions. So as you would all know, the treaty opened for signature in 1968 as a result of joint drafts prepared by the Soviet Union and the United States at that time over a period of 2 or 3 years, starting from 1967, and the then 18-nation Disarmament Commission. Treaty entered into force in 1970 when 40 states, including the 3 depositories, United Kingdom, United States, and the Soviet Union, had ratified. Now, in 1968, the countries of quote-unquote proliferation concern, to use a terminology that some use today, were not the so-called countries of concern of today. They were the advanced industrial countries of Western Europe, Germany, Japan, Italy, Sweden, and so on. So these countries were very reluctant to join up to a treaty where they were renouncing, quote unquote, their right to nuclear weapons. So in response to doing that, they wanted, to make sure that there would be commitments to nuclear disarmament, that nothing would impede their right to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes across the entire spectrum, including uranium enrichment and separation of plutonium. But they also wanted not to sign up to a treaty that was forever. So the treaty was given an initial period of life of 25 years after entry into force, after which the states parties would meet to decide on the future of the treaty. And the treaty itself provided the 3 viable options under Article 10.2 of the NPT that I'll come to in a minute. Now, the review process of the NPT is generally done across so-called 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is nuclear disarmament, Pillar 2 is nuclear non-proliferation, and Pillar 3 is cooperation in peaceful uses of nuclear energy. There is now an emerging unfortunate tendency spawned by some of the nuclear weapon states and some of their allies dependent on dependent on arrangements, defense arrangements underpinned by nuclear weapons, where they basically say that the non-proliferation treaty is a non-proliferation treaty, and they try to lower the expectations on nuclear disarmament. And this is something that we in civil society and in non-nuclear weapon states need to push back against. Now, this concept of a periodic review, which was also provided for in the treaty, that there should be a review of the implementation of the treaty every 5 years, was in a way to try to redress the imbalance. The nuclear weapon states under Article 6, as you know, were committed to negotiate in good faith to end the nuclear arms race at an early date and to conclude a treaty on general and complete disarmament. So there was no timeline there, and there was no concrete commitment. In contrast, under Article 2 and Article 3 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, non-nuclear weapon states had renounced nuclear weapons and had accepted full-scope, comprehensive verification of the entirety of their nuclear activities to be carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and this should be done within 180 days of signing the treaty. So there was this imbalance, and the review process was designed that the non-nuclear weapon states could evaluate how the treaty was being implemented. And it was also a way for the majority, which obviously are the non-nuclear weapon states, to express their views on how to strengthen the future implementation of the treaty. And finally, each review conference to come up with some recommendations or conclusions for the next 5-year period on how to strengthen and enhance the authority, integrity, and implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think all of you would know that we have had generally a mixed record of a successful review conference agreeing on an outcome document followed by a failed review conference. Now, for the first time, we have had 2 successive failed review conferences, one in 2015 and the postponed 2020 review conference that was held in 2022. And all the signs are today, given the deteriorating state of relations between Moscow and Washington and China and Washington and the situation over Ukraine, that next year's review conference is also heading for a train crash. So the only instance where we've had a fully negotiated review document that is looking at the implementation of the previous 5-year period and recommendations for strengthening the treaty over the next 5-year period was at the 2020 review conference, which also was important for the so-called 13 practical steps for the systematic elimination of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, most of these steps have now been abandoned by the nuclear weapon states, and some of them were diluted in the 2010 action plan that was agreed at that review conference. So looking at the NPT review process, this concept originally came out of Canada. We called it at that time an enhanced review process. And the idea here was to use the leverage provided by the Extension Conference to invest in the preparatory process more substantive powers for discussion. Until 1995, the 3 sessions or 4 sessions of a preparatory committee in the previous years could only discuss matters of procedure, dates, rules of procedure, and so on, but they could not discuss substance, such as nuclear disarmament, nuclear safeguards, and so on. So our idea was that from now on, after the treaty was extended indefinitely, the review process should also be able to discuss this. And in a sense, a PrepCom could be a sort of a mini conference to see how the previously agreed recommendations, principles, and objectives were being implemented. So 3 principal objectives or principles were envisioned. So we were making the treaty permanent, but there needed to be accountability, especially by the nuclear weapon states. We were to qualitatively strengthen the review process that evaluated how we were implementing the treaty, how progress was being made, especially on nuclear disarmament goals, and also to come up with new goals for the future years. And then finally, to be more pragmatic and dynamic and to avoid politicization to the extent possible. I'll skip this slide. So again, to sort of summarize, the review process from 1995 onward was supposed to be a living process, so to speak, and product-oriented. That is to produce a final outcome document by consensus at a review conference and to outline realistic and practical goals and to provide for review conferences that are both evaluating and also projecting new goals and actions for us to implement, or practical agendas for concrete future action. So the review process is structured along, we have a gap year after a review conference, and then in the next 3 years, there's a preparatory committee, and then we have a review conference in the 5th year. This structure was upended by the postponement of the 2020 review conference. So now we've had only 4 years between 2022 and the next review conference. And then at the next review conference will be in 2030. And after that, we go back to a 5-year cycle. So we have 3 preparatory committees. So the first preparatory committee is chaired by a representative from the Western and Others group. And the chair of PrepCom 1 also goes on to be the chair of the main committee at the review conference that deals with peaceful uses. The second PrepCom is chaired by a representative of the Eastern European group, and this chair goes on to chair the second main committee, which deals with safeguards and regional issues. And then the chair of the third PrepCom, which is the last PrepCom before a review conference, is from the non-aligned movement, and that chair also goes to chair the most important main committee, in my view, that is on nuclear disarmament. So in the review conference itself, we have a plenary, general debate, adoption of the agenda, etc. And at the very end, the plenary would meet on the last day to adopt a final outcome document if that was to be adopted, so to speak. So the work of a review conference over 20 working days is carried out through main committees. So as I mentioned, main committee 1 on disarmament issues, main committee 2 on non-proliferation and regional issues, and main committee 3 on peaceful uses. In 1995, we also agreed that each main committee could also appoint a subsidiary body to discuss focused issues, or to have a focused discussion on issues on which people could agree. For example, under main committee 1 on negative security assurances, or a fissile material cutoff treaty, or risk reduction, or now that we have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, or any other issue related to nuclear disarmament. And then the two other main committees would also have subsidiary bodies discussing relevant issues for that committee. Now, the idea was that the subsidiary body is subsidiary to the main committee, and the main committee would report to the plenary and the president. But here we ended up with a clash of egos, because the chairs of subsidiary bodies felt that they were co-equal with the chair of a main committee, and they had no responsibility to coordinate the work of a subsidiary body with their main committee, and in their view, to report independently to the president. So this has created a lot of friction at review conferences after 1995, except for 2020, and particularly in 2015 and 2022. So main committee one is always the most contentious, and review conferences have failed for the most part on disagreement on issues on nuclear disarmament. The conference in 2005 failed on main committee two issue, that is nuclear weapon-free zones, in particular establishing a zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction in the region of the Middle East. In main committee three on peaceful uses, there are generally no controversial issues, but the non-aligned and some others may hold some issues, quote unquote, hostage to be agreed upon once there is agreement on outstanding issues in the two other main committees. So the review conference in 1995, in order to get to an extension decision, based the extension decision on a legally binding decision, that is on extension, based on two politically binding decisions, one on the review process and one, as you know, the principles and objectives for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So for the first time in 1995, it was clarified that the PrepCom is to discuss principles and objectives for the full implementation of the treaty and make recommendations to the review conference, and also to do procedural arrangements, dates, etc., and that subsidiary bodies could be established for specific issues, as I just mentioned. And that the review conference, importantly, has a dual focus, looking back at the previous 5-year period and looking forward at the next 5-year period. And therefore, it is an expectation that there would be an outcome document reflecting this. So the next time we met was in 2000. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the preparatory committee sessions from 1997, 98, 99 failed to implement this permanence with accountability. My view is that the Secretariat of the NPT was unduly influenced by the nuclear weapon states, who did not want to see a strengthened review process, and they wanted to revert to the pre-1995 way of doing business. And that's what happened, which led us in 2000 to try to further elaborate on the strengthened review process. So first of all, the decisions from 1995 are sacrosanct. So we do not want to reopen them, because if we do, then we are also reopening the decision on indefinite extension of the treaty. So the innovation that we agreed in 2000 was that the first two sessions of the PrepCom need not agree on an outcome, but the last session of a PrepCom had the responsibility, based on the discussions at that session and the previous two sessions, to try to agree on recommendations to the review conference. Now, the review conference would use this as a guide, not as a final, in a sense, a diktat, so to speak. Now, many countries came up with the excuse that we cannot give recommendations to the review conference in a year in advance, because we don't know what our final position would be. And then people like me would say, well, in this year, you could say what you want the review conference could do, and then at the review conference itself, you could update the recommendations based on the prevailing security situation and whether anything has changed. But generally, there was a lot of resistance to doing anything of this sort. So there was only one time when a PrepCom agreed to have a summary, and that was Ambassador Henrik Salander of Sweden, who, before he became a diplomat, was a member of a pop group in Stockholm. And so he, in a sense, sang a summary. So I've sort of just put the text of that, and this was quite an unusual event at a PrepCom, where he pulled out his guitar, so to speak, and talked about his summary. So now we come to the 2020 review conference that was held in 2022. That failed over the issue of references, in particular to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But also there were important differences over nuclear disarmament. The nuclear weapon states were quite successful in rolling back from the 2010 and 2000 review conference outcomes on various elements for making progress in nuclear disarmament. So there was no agreement at this review conference. Nonetheless, the president of the conference, Ambassador Gustavo Slavanen, decided that he should at least get something out of it. So there was a decision that the review process should be re-examined in the next 3 years before the next review conference. So he suggested that there should be a working group that would look at improving the efficiency, effectiveness, transparency, accountability, coordination, and continuity of the review process. Quite a mouthful. So this then was held here in Vienna in 2023, just before the first session of the PrepCom. It was chaired by Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen of Finland. This was a closed meeting, and there were a variety of proposals, but in the end, this also failed. And my view is that the problem is not the review process. The problem is that countries have competing political objectives. They are not prepared to compromise. And then they blame the process for not being able to agree, rather than looking at themselves, that they come to a review conference with positions that cannot be agreed by the vast majority. And here again, we need to look at the nuclear weapon states and the 35 or so states that depend on nuclear security provided by their patrons with nuclear weapons. So at the last PrepCom that was held this year, chaired by Ambassador Harold Agyemang of Ghana, again, there was no recommendation for so there was no agreement on recommendations to the review conference. He did produce a paper on the strengthened review process, and he also produced draft recommendations for on the 3 pillars. He did not open the recommendations for the 3 pillars for any discussion on the last 2 days, because he could see that there was no agreement on the principal issues, especially on disarmament. But he opened up for discussion his paper on strengthening the review process. And again, that really went nowhere because a lot of the proposals really were not very realistic. And some of them basically repeated the practice that is already in place of having three different chairs for the main committees, subsidiary bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So there was actually no innovation that was proposed. And countries were not in a mood to agree on anything in any case. So people left the 2025 PrepCom in a bad and sour mood. And that sour mood has not improved. And given the situation in the continuing war in Ukraine, now the war that just ended, so to speak, in Gaza, the economic warfare going on between the principal economic powers of today, all of this feeds into the NPT review process. So I, for one, am not very hopeful. So the president of the review conference next year will be from the non-aligned movement from the Far East. This is Ambassador Do Hong Viet from Vietnam. And so we already have the dates, which you can see on the screen for the review conference next year. So what is the mandate of a review conference? It is to evaluate the results of the period under review, to address how to strengthen the treaty and its implementation, and to have a final document in 2 parts. That is the standard understanding, but that is now contested, so to speak. Also, NPT review conferences are meetings of states parties. They are not meetings of the United Nations. And therefore, the rules of procedure of the UN General Assembly are not applicable. We have our own rules of procedure, but many times the default is to go into the UN General Assembly rules of procedure and then get bogged down into legalisms. Now, fortunately, UN Web TV Live is covering all of the proceedings of the review conference, but this is something ad hoc and, in my view, needs to be regularized. So coming towards the conclusion, in my view, the review process is not broken. The problem is inability to compromise. There's a deepening divide on disarmament and the Middle East. The TPNW has become a major point of contention between the nuclear weapon states and those states that depend on defense arrangements underpinned by nuclear weapons. NATO nuclear sharing now is also becoming a very contentious issue. The NATO countries have now come up with a narrative, which I, for one, absolutely reject and challenge. And their narrative goes something like this: that NATO nuclear weapons have been assimilated and regularized, so to speak, in the NPT review process. They are not a contradiction to Article 6. or to Article 1 and 2 of the NPT. Because it was agreed 50 years ago, there's no need to change the situation. But more and more now there is pushback against NATO nuclear sharing, and I think civil society has an important role in continuing this discussion and also to bring more information to bear. We also have now a loss of civility in discourse. People are rude to each other. There are very lengthy statements and working papers that nobody has time to read, especially the president or chair of an NPT meeting. We really have not much interaction between the weapon states and the non-weapon states. They are both speaking past each other. So here I'm showing you the list of the number of paragraphs that come up for agreement on the last 2 or 3 days of a review conference. In 2022, we had a document of 287 paragraphs. So can one imagine agreeing to everything in such a long document? Now, this year's PrepCom fortunately had only 69 paragraphs. I wrote the one in 2014 and it was only 17 paragraphs. So that's what I've been proposing to delegates, to keep the outcome document short and not repetitive, and not put everything in a document that they want to see, because it's basically a self-defeating process. Now there is a new narrative that a final document is not a requirement. It's sufficient that we come and meet at the review conference, we have a discussion, and then we can go home satisfied that we met for 20 working days and we discussed the treaty across its 3 pillars with our agreements and disagreements. And we come back to meet in another 5 years, and in the meantime, we have 3 PrepCom sessions. So in my view, this is a waste of resources, our attention. It also means that the nuclear weapon states are escaping accountability for their delivery on arms control and disarmament objectives. Now, consensus. This is an interesting line, that there is no understanding or no consensus on what is the meaning of consensus. The rules of procedure under the NPT does not elaborate what it is. It just says every effort should be made. It doesn't define it. So there are different interpretations. Consensus does not mean unanimous agreement. It means that nobody puts their hand up and objects. They may support it or they may not support it, but they're not aggrieved by it to the extent that they deny agreement. Another view of consensus is it's a convergence of views on which people agree and on which they don't agree, but there's a balance that everyone feels that they have something in the document. It's not everything that they want, and it's not that bad that they feel compelled to say no to it. Now, the NPT is a multilateral treaty, and multilateralism is based on the principle of sovereignty. And therefore, for multilateral regimes, their strength depends on the agreement and assent and support of their member states. So if the member states of a regime like the NPT are quarreling and their default is to disagree, then this is, in my view, detracting from the legitimacy of that regime. And we do not want the Non-Proliferation Treaty to collapse, because this is the only agreement and the only forum where the 5 nuclear weapon states are prepared to hold themselves accountable and to explain what they have done. We do not see this in the First Committee. We do not see this in the Conference on Disarmament. It's only in the NPT, where there is still a saving grace that they feel compelled to defend their record in their view of their implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. So, political will. This is an interesting quote by the former Foreign Minister of Gareth Evans, who led the Canberra Commission many years ago on promoting nuclear disarmament, and also on the Tokyo Commission, that political will is never waiting in the cupboard to be taken out. We have to nurture it, and we have to fight for it, and we have to develop it. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, now the conditions are not right for that. Now, last 2 slides. Bad practices, in my view, to avoid lengthy statements. Do not introduce extraneous issues into the NPT review process. Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is one, but it belongs under Main Committee 2 on nuclear safety and security, and you just keep it there and don't bring it across all of the discussion in all of the meetings of the NPT. And here, in my view, the European Union now is a disruptive actor, both on nuclear disarmament, especially TPNW, on NATO nuclear sharing, and also now on the war on Ukraine. There's a loss of habits of dialogue, and people are getting argumentative. Now, another way of doing this is to go to a small group of friends of the chair, 20, 25 countries, and they go and hide nowadays in somebody's embassy or mission, which means all the rest of us are sitting in the big conference room, twiddling our thumbs, waiting for this empowered 20, 25 countries to decide on our behalf without consulting us what goes into an outcome document. And things to do, to have concise statements, keep focus on NPT issues, do not congregate in selective groups to push specific issues, have a laser focus on formulating concise recommendations for future implementation of the treaty, be inclusive and transparent in discussions and consultations with the chair and the president. And lastly, to move the venue from New York to Vienna. New York now is becoming increasingly unaffordable for civil society. If you want to get a hotel room in Manhattan, you're paying $300, $400 a day, and very likely at night you will have visitors in your room that have 4 legs and a tail, small mice. It's the place of the Security Council. It's very heavily politicized. You do not have the expertise in nuclear disarmament issues in New York. It is the capital of a nuclear weapon state. So why are we, non-nuclear weapon states, doing this important conference in the capital of a nuclear weapon state, particularly one that is not, in my view, fully observant of its Article 6 commitments, and so on. So all 3 pillars of the NPT are represented in Vienna. It's cheaper, safer city. Nobody has a problem getting visas, like the Russians, Iranians, Venezuelans, Cubans, and a whole bunch of others, in violation of the host state agreement, are denied visas or get visas very late for New York. So I will stop there, and we can discuss other related issues like nuclear risk reduction, TPNW, or anything else that people might be interested in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tariq, for a really interesting insight into the processes behind this piece of international law that I think we don't get to hear about very often. I can see immediately we have 2 hands up, and I will come to those questions in one moment. Just to say that we have around 20 minutes available for discussion, and I'll come to anyone who raises their hand in the order in which they appear on my screen. I just ask that you would come to your question as directly as possible, just in terms of timekeeping, so we can get through as many questions as possible this afternoon. And please excuse me if I offer you some encouragement in getting to your question. Julian, I see that your hand is up. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, James. So Tariq, I just want to know your assessment of how the Iran issue is going to impact, especially the bombing of the American bombing of Iran.
So shall I answer the questions one by one?
Please, yes.
Okay, nice to see you, Jolene. This is a very important question. And I've written about it, and it will be published in Arms Control today in November. But the IAEA issued a report on the 31st of May, which showed that the 3 enrichment facilities had been verified by the IAEA, and there was no problem in safeguards implementation. The outstanding issues related to Iran's activities going back to the early 2000s. So a depository state of the NPT, a permanent member of the NPT, in association with a non-party to the NPT, go and bomb safeguarded nuclear facilities in a non-nuclear weapon state while IAEA inspectors are present on the ground, in my view, is a direct assault on the integrity and authority of the IAEA and the agency's safeguard system. Now, after the snapback mechanism was triggered by the 3 European countries on the 28th of September, the Iranians ceased all cooperation with the IAEA. In between the bombing and the 28th of September, they had allowed IAEA inspectors to visit the Bushehr nuclear power plant and the Tehran research reactor, which were not bombed. And the Bushehr reactor was visited under pressure to Iran by Russia, saying that our cooperation agreement to get the reactor and the fuel means you have to have safeguards. On the 18th of October, the JCPOA and the Resolution 2231 expired. So now there is a big fight between China, Russia, Iran, and some others on the one side and the Western countries on the other side over whether the JCPOA is still alive or not, whether Iran is accountable. And Iran at the moment has said, I do not cooperate with the IAEA at all. So we have a board meeting coming up in November, and I suspect that the EU or the E3 with their friends across the Atlantic may want to push for another resolution of non-compliance against Iran. And that will create another crisis both here at the IAEA and next year, where I don't think Iran would be in a mood to say yes to any outcome document just out of vengeance, I think.
I see a question here from our own Tim Street in the chat. Tim, do you mind if I read your question out, or would you like to pose it? Okay. What status do or should RevCon final documents have in your view? It seems that nuclear weapon states treat them, e.g. the 2010 action plan, as political rather than a legal document, and thus not having the same force or value as NPT articles. Can I ask, what's your view on the status of the documents?
Mm-hmm. So some of the nuclear weapon states lately have come up with the narrative that we implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty as it is written. And the outcomes that we may have agreed at different review conferences are political commitments of that time. So if we agreed to something in 2010, that was in 2010. Today we are in 2025 or 2026. The world has changed, and what we might have agreed to in 2010 may not be relevant today in today's environment. And unfortunately, there isn't sufficient pushback, in my view, from the non-aligned. Of course, there would not be pushback from the European states or client states of nuclear weapon states on these views. So this is where civil society, I think, in my view, needs to further strengthen the capacity of the non-aligned countries in providing the thinking and providing some inputs and background into the pushback against this narrative that what was agreed at a review conference was in that context, in that time frame, and not necessarily translated across the time horizon to current times. And the world has changed. To quote them, our security situation has changed. And then we have these buzz concepts, undiminished security for all. And so they say, well, if we do something, then our security is diminished, and we all agreed undiminished security for all. So we are stuck with some of these old concepts, and I do not see a viable way of sort of pushing back against them. I cannot hear
Thank
you.
Yeah, I'll just and I'm going to pose it again to everyone here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I see Tim, you have your hand raised again. If you'd like to come back to Tariq.
I thought I might as well, because kind of Tariq invited us to talk about the ban treaty, so I thought I think people would be interested to know what your thoughts are on prospects for progress with the TPNW, how it relates to the NPT, and your general thoughts on as you say, you talk a lot about the framing of the NWS. So your view on how the NWS nuclear weapon states frame it as a threat or undermining the NPT. What is your views on those kind of issues? Thanks.
So I've always supported the view that the TPNW is an effective measure as called for under Article 6, just as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty or a fissile material cutoff treaty are not contrary to the NPT. And if nuclear weapon-free zone treaties are accepted, because each one of those treaties, that title is the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, or in Central Asia. So if those regional prohibition treaties are not considered to be contradictory to the NPT or undermining the NPT, how is it that the TPNW is considered to be undermining the treaty? Those were prohibition treaties in a region. The TPNW is a global prohibition treaty. So that is one. Secondly, the TPNW's, one of its main successes was it's taken away the narrative from the deterrence lobby that nuclear weapons are good, that nuclear weapons provide for the security of the world, and nuclear deterrence should continue and be strengthened. It's very difficult for them to stand up and defend nuclear weapons. And so this has created a lot of frustration for them and the backlash. And the strongest critics of the TPNW from the weapon states tend to be the French for some reason. The TPNW states decided at this year's PrepCom and also at the review conference not to be confrontational and not to push language that in their view would be perceived as confrontational by the deterrence states. They also say that there is a lot of pressure on the signatory states not to ratify, and on those states that might be considering signing the treaty to not sign the treaty. So now we are at 99 and a 100th signature is expected shortly, but the ratifications are stuck at about 78 or 79. And the momentum is being lost there because of this big pressure behind the scenes on these smaller countries against this particular treaty. So I think we need to keep at it, and at the next TPNW meeting of states parties to again agree on a stronger outcome document. I thought that the one at the last meeting could have been better, but I think again the states parties decided, particularly the core group, that they did not want such a strong outcome document from the TPNW that in their view would alienate the weapon states or the deterrence crowd even more, or get even stronger pushback from them. So they're trying to balance this relationship between the deterrence states. And now that disarmament is completely off the agenda, everybody is into rebuilding the military, is into strengthening deterrence. Disarmament now is basically a bad word. People are shy of using it, of talking about it. So in the current context, I think the TPNW states, this is my reading of it, want to play it very carefully and not further enhance the antagonisms that exist against that treaty and also against them as parties to it.
Thanks very much. I can see Pugwash, you have your hand raised. If you would like to go ahead with your question, and then I'll turn to the questions in the chat. Pugwash, please go ahead.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tariq. It's always a pleasure listening to you. I'm Kuda. I'm an Arms Control Negotiations Academy Fellow. My question is with regards to Article 6 of the NPT ahead of the next review conference. How do you envision the discussions around Article 6 with the current developments that have been taking place within the NPT and outside of the NPT, and how there's been some form of momentum around nuclear disarmament verification? We've seen at the UN, GA, Norway, and Brazil, they've tabled a proposal on a resolution on the establishment of a group of scientific and technical experts. How do you see verification playing some form of a role for progressive and positive discussions on disarmament at the next NPT?
Well, thank you for that. So recently, the Russian Federation proposed to the US to extend for 1 year, maintaining the numerical limits under New START, 1,550 deployed warheads, 700 deployed delivery systems, plus 100 non-deployed systems. So the US has not formally responded to it. On the 21st of October, Austria had a joint statement with several countries. The only NATO country in that was Norway. Unfortunately, my own country, Canada, was not in there. And that statement basically called for the two sides, Washington and Moscow, to work towards negotiating a new treaty. They decided not to welcome the Russian proposal for extending the central strategic limits because they thought there was pushback against it, particularly from some EU states. So their pushback was, if it's anything coming out of Moscow, we can't agree to it. Secondly, the United States has not said yes, so it's premature to welcome the Russian proposal, even if you decided to do so. So it's surprising that very few countries supported the Austrian statement. It had the usual ones, Egypt, New Zealand, Ireland, Mexico, and so on. but the vast majority, for some reason, were not willing to co-sponsor that statement. And perhaps they were also afraid of getting the ire of a certain world leader in this current context. So I really, as I mentioned, I'm very pessimistic on the disarmament front. I've been to many think tank type forums in the US, and there's all deterrence. No, in one case, in the final, in a sense, not document, but declaration out of a meeting, they did not even want to say that the NPT has disarmament in it. They wanted to keep it just to non-proliferation and peaceful uses, and I had to fight to say, if you want my agreement, you have to put disarmament in. So at the moment, we on the disarmament side, in my view, are on a losing wicket. People on the deterrence side are on a much stronger position. With this increased military spending, increased discourse on strengthening defenses, et cetera, we have an uphill task in my view.
Thanks. I'm just going to turn to a question in the chat from Dominique Lloyd. She asks, in this time of many difficulties with multilateralism, in your review, is it better to have a lowest common denominator outcome document agreed by all and at least some sense of success, or if there's no progressive agreed final document, to have no final document at all?
I would support having something. I think all countries are willing to pay lip service that we reaffirm what we agreed in 95, 2000, 2010 without getting into the details, and that they reaffirm that the NPT is the cornerstone of the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime and for peaceful cooperation or cooperation in peaceful uses of nuclear weapons. When it comes to putting some benchmarks, that's where the problems will arise. So many countries now are talking about risk reduction. Paul devised the stepping stones, which were picked up by Sweden. Maybe Paul can give us a brief update as to what the status of the stepping stones is, particularly now that Sweden is a member of NATO, and it also supported NATO nuclear sharing in a statement at the PrepCom this year. I'll stop there and maybe let Paul say something about the stepping stones, because in some cases, those who support disarmament, like Canada, are still putting their faith in the stepping stones approach.
Yeah, Paul, if you would like to come back, I can give you the floor for a minute. If not, I can maybe move on to the question or the point that you've raised in the chat about Iran. Beyond Iran, is there any hope arising from the November UN meetings on a WMD-free zone in the Middle East, feeding constructively into the NPT review conference? The zone in the past has been seen as poison to the smooth running of RevCons. What are your thoughts there?
So the UN meetings have basically taken the Middle East issue out of the NPT review process, because after 2005 and 2015, where the Middle East issue was one of the important breaking points, the Arab states were pressured to sort of not be the reason for discord at the review conference. So they adopted a resolution, I think in 2018, at the General Assembly, empowering the UN Secretary General to hold an annual conference on a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the region of the Middle East. So they've had 5 such conferences before, but in my view, they are making glacial progress. This is, in my view, basically marking time. They have a working group on definitions and so on, but this issue has been on the table for decades. We don't need to get bogged down in definitions and so on. The United States and Israel are firmly opposed to this conference, and they lobby against it and they denounce it. The Arab states bring the findings or the results of the last meeting to the review process. Everybody is happy in the sense that the Middle East issue is not a bone of contention any longer in the review conference. I argue that the 1995 resolution, the accountability for that is in the NPT review process. It is not in the Secretary General's conference on the Middle East zone. But not everybody agrees to it. People want to gloss over the Middle East issue. And now that, Abraham has come again to the world and we have Abraham Accords and these will be expanded. And also given the current political context in the Middle East, I think the Arab countries are very reluctant to take a stand on the Middle East zone and alienate some important power.
We have space for maybe one more question from the audience, and if I don't see any more hands, I might take advantage of my position and perhaps pose a question on AUKUS and the I suppose maybe I was wondering what your thoughts are on the potential precedent setting of the peaceful or the other uses of this sort of propulsion technology.
Mhm.
Do you expect to see nuclear weapon states at some point in the future regretting this type of technology sharing? They're happy to undertake this type of sharing themselves, but in future, do you see them regretting this decision?
So the non-application of safeguards on non-proscribed military uses, which is Article 14 of the NPT Safeguards Agreement, is something that I've been working on since 1987, when Canada was the first non-nuclear weapon state thinking about buying nuclear-powered submarines from the United Kingdom or from France. In the end, we in Canada decided not to go ahead in 1989 for financial reasons. So when in September 2021, the three AUKUS countries, Australia, UK, and the US, announced this, I was one of the first people. And if you Google my name and AUKUS, you will get many articles. So the problem with this is that the IAEA has never really defined how to deal with not applying safeguards on nuclear material in use in a non-proscribed military use. So non-proscribed military use can be submarines or ships with nuclear reactors because they are not bombs. The NPT prohibits bombs. So this particular article was included in 1972 when the Safeguards Agreement was being drafted for the NPT under Article 3 at the IAEA at the behest of Italy. And I think Germany also was supportive because at that time there were three nuclear-powered cargo ships, one Japanese, one German, and one Russian, and the Russian ship is still servicing as a commercial vessel. So in the IAEA, there is a process when we need to change something about safeguards because the safeguard system is universal. It applies to all NPT non-nuclear weapon states. And there is another element of universality. So the way in which the IAEA, for example, will implement safeguards of verification at a centrifuge plant is the same, whether it is in a non-nuclear weapon state, whether it is in a nuclear weapon state like China or Russia, or whether it is in a non-NPT state like India or Pakistan, for example. The procedures are the same. The legal status of these three types of countries might be different. So the usual process is that we have an open-ended working group of the member states of the IAEA, and they work out an arrangement which is then formalized. But in this case, the three countries pressurized the IAEA Secretariat that these three countries would negotiate in secret. And they took upon themselves the authority to set the standard for future such agreements on transfer of nuclear-powered ships and submarines to non-nuclear weapon states. So the ones who have been the most aggrieved and have pushed back the most are the Chinese. And every year they do a workshop. And again, if you go to the IAEA's webpage, you can find presentations by me and others highlighting the problems, with this approach. So there is no regret. For a time being, it was thought that there were second thoughts in Washington about supplying submarines to Australia. But I read just the other day that the deal will go ahead. But practically speaking, the US does not have the shipyards to make enough submarines for the US Navy and then also to make submarines for the Australian Navy. The same is the case for the UK. The UK also needs to replace its own subs, and they have only one shipyard. So nobody's going to privilege another navy over their own navy. And already in the US, there is pushback that the US shipyards should focus on supplying submarines to the US. The US requirement is, interestingly, 2.1 submarines per year. they can only produce one submarine per year. So in my view, even if the agreement survives on paper, in practice, it will not be possible. I did not talk about nuclear disarmament verification, so I want to just come back on that one. So there is the Brazilian Norwegian proposal to have a group of experts on that. So I gave a presentation at the Conference on Disarmament in March last year, the year before. So this is my view. Not everybody agrees with it. Since 1945, we have had 110,000 nuclear warheads. Today, we estimate that we have about 12,000. So what happened to the 98,000 warheads? How many of you or us are lying awake in our bed worrying about those 98,000 warheads? Those were dismantled quietly at 3,000, 4,000 warheads per year at Pantex and the Mayak facility in the US and in Russia, respectively. So my view is to follow the South Africa model. Each of the weapon states divests itself of its nuclear weapons. The IAEA goes and does some forensics. It will not be perfect verification because in contrast to South Africa, these programs are legacy programs with a lot of stuff that the agency will never be able to reconcile with. A lot of people have died, the records are lost, and none of the nuclear armed states is willing to allow any international verification or oversight of the dismantlement of a warhead. The rest of the military fuel cycle one can monitor in one way or another. But the dismantlement of the warhead is the key, because the unit of account is the warhead. And if none of the 9 is prepared to allow somebody else to look over their shoulder as the warhead is being dismantled, I feel that this is a time waste. I wouldn't say time wasting exercise, but it's a diversionary exercise. We will expend so much time on talking about nuclear disarmament verification that we lose sight of reductions under negotiated treaties or unilateral reductions under the presidential nuclear initiatives of 1991, which led to several thousand warheads coming offline, non-strategic warheads. So I would propose the model that I just talked about. We could talk about disarmament verification. There's also a working group under the TPNW, and these are well-meaning people, and they've come up with very interesting proposals that are technically sound or could be technically sound. But in my view, politically, they have zero chance of being put in a piece of paper, negotiated, ratified by national parliaments, then implemented. And then who is the body that will verify? What is the international mechanism that will do the verification? So for that, there are no good answers. So a group of technical experts can come up with very nice methodologies, but that's all that they can come up with. So I'm in the minority with this particular view, but I still stand by it.
Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion today on a really wide range of important issues for the review conference and for the prospects for disarmament and non-proliferation into the future. On behalf of everybody who attended today, I want to say thank you very much for giving us your insights and your thoughts on these complex issues. I'd like to invite anybody who's attended today who would like to join British Pugwash. We have a membership link in the chat at the moment. I'd also like to thank Tim Street for helping organize today's event. And you, Tariq, just want to say thank you very much once again for a really interesting discussion on today's session. Thank you to everybody who's attended. I hope you enjoyed today's session. If you have any questions or any thoughts or feedback, please do get in touch with either myself or Tim Street. You'll be able to share this link or share this today's session. We'll have the recording up on YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon at our next session. So please do stay in touch with British Pugwash. Once again, thank you very much, Tariq. Thank you, Tim. And thank you all for attending.